I invite you to open your Bibles with me to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28. We've reached the very last chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. This is the 79th message in our Following Jesus series through the Gospel of Matthew, and we've reached the very last chapter. I've got some very good news to share with you from Matthew chapter 28 today. Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. So let's say it together. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen. That's what we're going to learn in Matthew chapter 28. In chapter 27, Jesus was crucified. He died on Friday. He was buried. They rolled a big stone in front of his tomb. They posted a guard to make sure that his body wasn't stolen. And for all of Saturday, on the Sabbath, things were silent. And then, on Sunday morning, everything changed. Everything changed. When things had just gone from bad to worse, and it just got worse, and it just got worse, well, now everything begins to be made better, and so much better that it was frightening. This message is entitled, Afraid, Yet Filled with Joy, which is what it says the women were in verse 8 when they heard the news of Jesus' resurrection. They were afraid, but filled with joy. Now, we're going to see today that both of those reactions were justified. There was good reason for both the fright and the delight. Afraid, yet filled with joy. Let's see what happened. Matthew chapter 28, verse 1. Follow along with me. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Do you remember these ladies? We said last week to pay special attention to them. They are often overlooked, but they were very important. They were faithful disciples of our Lord, and they knew exactly where the tomb was. Remember, they had been there and they had watched on Friday when they buried Jesus. They went to look at the tomb. Now, the other Gospels tell us that they had brought more spices to anoint his body early that Sunday morning. But here's what happened. Verse 2. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. Oh my. Another earthquake. This one, Matthew says, was because there was an angel landing. The angel descends from heaven and it shakes the ground. And then this angel rolls the stone back and sits on it. And he looks like lightning? I don't know what that means. Bright, shining, flashing, electrical. And his clothes were as white as snow. Brilliant. How would you feel if you encountered that? I would be scared. And we know how the guards felt. Look at verse 4. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Oh, big tough guys. They've seen it all, but they've never seen anything like this. These guys faint and pass out. They're afraid, and they're not filled with joy. And when they wake up, they decide to lie about it. We'll see more about that in a second. How about these women? How do they feel? Well, they were afraid too. I know I would be. But the angel talks to them, not to the guards, but he talks to the women. Listen to verse 5. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." Wow. What a message to receive, huh? By the way, this just doesn't happen. I mean, it doesn't ever happen. Every time you and I go by the cemetery, the same people are still in their same graves. I've never seen an angel sitting on a tombstone and saying, "Oh no, that guy's not here anymore. He got up and walked out. Check it out." That never happens. So if it did happen this way, this is big news. How would you feel if you got that news from a living lightning bolt? Afraid, right? And so were they. But more than that, they were also filled with joy. Verse 8. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Yes, they were afraid. But even more than that, they were filled with joy. The Greek word there for filled with joy is mega. They had mega joy, great joy. It's the same thing the Magi felt back in Matthew chapter 2 when they were overjoyed to see the Christ child. These eyewitness women had joy welling up inside of them and spilling out. and they had every reason to rejoice. I can think of at least 3 reasons to rejoice just from right here, and they're just as true for us today. Rejoice, number 1, because Jesus is risen. He is no longer dead. Death could not hold him. The grave could not keep him from rising again. Everything bad that has ever happened has been reversed. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Jesus is alive, and that changes everything, doesn't it? There isn't a thing that isn't changed by the reality of the resurrection. The resurrection brings hope, it brings joy, it brings peace. It changes the ending of the story that we are living in. It feels sometimes like we're living in a tragedy. Right now, with the global pandemic, it feels like this is not going to end well. And it might get worse. And it might get even more worse. And it might get even more worse. But the resurrection says that everything bad is going to be undone. It's going to be reversed. Jesus is going to reverse the curse. And he's proven that he can do it by rising from the dead. As Christians, we have every reason to rejoice because Jesus is risen. Number 2, because Jesus is reliable. Rejoice because Jesus is reliable. I love those 4 words in verse 6 where he says, he is not here. He has risen just as he said. Just as he said. How many times has Jesus promised in the Gospel of Matthew that he would come back from the dead? He said it again and again and again. Now the disciples, they didn't know what he was talking about, but he's promised it over and over again. And now this angel comes along and says, Jesus has done it. Jesus is faithful. He has kept all of his promises, even the impossible ones. Now, you and I often make promises we could fulfill, but we just don't. We're unfaithful. And sadly, we also make promises that we cannot fulfill. We aren't able. But when Jesus makes a promise, even if it takes coming back from the dead, Jesus keeps his promise. He is that reliable. I don't know about you, but I need to be reminded of that often. I need to be reminded of that today. Whatever Jesus has said he will do, even if it takes a miracle. That's a reason to rejoice. And here's the 3rd one. Jesus is real. Jesus is not a myth, and his resurrection is not just a story. This really happened. The angel actually said, come and see the place where he lay, and they could check it out for themselves. He is not here. This is not just a story. These are eyewitnesses who saw it with their own eyes. The tomb was empty. No wonder the women ran away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy. And look what happened next. Verse 9. Suddenly, Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me. I love that his first words are basically, hey there. He doesn't say, it is I, bum, bum, bum. He just says, greetings. The women knew exactly what they were seeing. They were seeing Jesus, their Lord. And they were touching him. Verse 9 says, they came to him, they clasped his feet and worshiped him. I love that they were able to grab his feet. Those were real feet. Jesus was not a ghost. He's not a hallucination. He's not a vision. Jesus is a real resurrected man. They could grab his feet. And they did. And then they worshiped him. Notice that Jesus receives their worship. He doesn't say, oh, stop that, stop, I'm just a man. He takes their worship as due him. He really is risen, and he really is the Son of God, worthy of our worship. Jesus says the same thing to them that the angel did. He says, do not be afraid. Now, friends, that's not a rebuke. That's comfort. He's not like, why are you so afraid? He's just saying, no, don't be scared. I mean, the natural thing here in the presence of a resurrected man is to be afraid. It's natural and justified. But Jesus comforts them. He says, it's all good. And he tells them, verse 10, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me, because he's real. Now, next week, Lord willing, we'll see what happens in Galilee. But first, we have to see how the guards and the enemies of Jesus respond to what has happened on that first Resurrection Sunday. Verse 11. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of hush money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him, probably with more money, and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So which story do you believe? Jesus is real, but these guys are fakes. They are desperate to try to damage control the situation, so they concoct this crazy cover story, which doesn't really add up. They were all asleep? Yeah, right. Roman soldiers did not sleep on the job, and if they did, they did it in shifts. And they would wake in a moment's notice if there was an attack. Jesus' disciples stole the body? Yeah, right. How do they know that if they were all asleep? What about that stone being rolled away? Did they sleep through that too? These guys could have been executed for failing to do their duty. They couldn't even guard a dead guy. This cockamamie story would be funny if it weren't so sad, and so many people get taken in by it, even today. Who do you believe? I believe these women. I believe the angel. I believe the Gospel of Matthew. I believe that Jesus is risen, reliable, and real, and therefore we have every reason to rejoice. I know that right now we have reasons to be afraid, and the fears are real, not just imagined. We live in a broken world, and things are not as they should be. Death is on the loose. And because of a scary virus, we are not even gathering in this building right here and witnessing baptisms and singing together, "Christ the Lord is risen today." But Christ the Lord is risen today. And that means that everything bad is going to be made good. The curse will be reversed. Jesus has kept his promises, and he will keep every one of his promises, even those that require a miracle. This is not just a myth or a symbol or a story. This is real. This is history. And this is the story that we're living in today. So we may have a little justification for our fright, but we have even more reason for our delight. So let me assure you as well, do not be afraid. Be filled with great joy. And go and tell others, he is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed.